My name is Maren Ellison, and I want you to picture this. 200 people in folding chairs under string lights, a hardware store with a brand new sign glowing behind us, and my father standing at a podium holding a microphone like it was a weapon he'd been saving for exactly this moment. To my son Derek, he said, raising his glass, the only one of my children who ever actually believed in this family. The crowd laughed, thinking it was a joke. I was sitting in the second row in a blue dress I'd bought specifically for tonight, clapping along with everyone else, because that's what I always did at my father's events. I clapped, I smiled, I made myself smaller so the room had space for whoever he wanted to shine. Then he looked directly at me, not at the crowd, at me. Some people, he said, show up when it's convenient. Some people show up every single day for 40 years. I know which one built this store back up. And it wasn't the daughter who couldn't even be bothered to invest in her own family's legacy. The string lights kept glowing. The crowd kept smiling, a little uncertain now, the way people do when they sense something is happening but don't want to be the first to admit it. My mother's hand found my knee under the table and squeezed it, not comfort, I realized later. A warning, don't. I stood up anyway. I walked to the podium in my blue dress in front of 200 people and I took the microphone out of my father's hand. Thank you, Dad, I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised me more than anything else that night. I think that's enough of a toast. I handed the microphone to the event coordinator standing off to the side, and I walked back to my seat, and the DJ, God bless that man, put on music within about 11 seconds, because somebody needed to fill the silence and it clearly wasn't going to be my father. That was the first shock of the night. Here's the second, and this one didn't come from a stage. 2 weeks later, going through a box of documents I needed for something completely unrelated, my own mortgage refinance, I found a manila folder in my mother's filing cabinet labeled Ellison Hardware Ownership Transfer. My name was on the transfer document. My signature was on the transfer document. I had never signed anything. If you're watching this right now, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I read every comment, and tonight's story is one I need you to stay with till the end, because it gets a lot bigger than a bad toast at a birthday party. My family's hardware store, Ellison & Sons, though it was originally just Ellison's, started by my grandfather in 1968, had just been quietly signed over to my brother, using a signature that wasn't mine. And I was about to spend the next 8 months finding out exactly how deep that lie went and who else had signed their name to it. To understand why that toast cut as deep as it did, you need to understand what that store actually was. My grandfather, Joseph Ellison, opened the original hardware store on Route 9 in 1968 with a loan he paid off in 11 years by working 6 days a week and sleeping in the back office more nights than my grandmother ever liked to admit. When he died in 1994, my father, Walter, inherited it, expanded it into a small regional chain, 3 locations by the time I was in high school, and never let any of us forget that the store was the Ellison legacy. I worked there every summer starting at 14. Not because I loved retail, I didn't particularly, but because it was the one place my father seemed to actually see me. Stocking shelves next to him on a Saturday morning, he'd talk to me like an adult. Ask my opinion about inventory, about a difficult customer, about whether we should carry a new brand of paint. Those mornings were, for a long time, the best version of my relationship with my father. Derek, my younger brother by 3 years, wanted nothing to do with the store growing up. He went to college for marketing, worked at an ad agency in Chicago for 6 years, and only came back to Millbrook, our hometown, after that agency laid off half its staff during a downturn. He'd been back 18 months when the big anniversary renovation happened. New flooring, updated signage, a fresh coat of paint on the building that had been there for over 50 years. My father framed it as modernizing the legacy, and asked Derek to run point on the renovation since Derek understood branding. I offered to help too. I had money saved. I'd been putting away savings for years, ever since I became a paralegal at Holloway & Chen, a mid-sized firm downtown, specializing in estate and property law of all things. The irony of that would come back around later. I offered my father $12,000 toward the renovation costs. He said thanks, but Derek had it handled. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured Derek wanted to prove himself. I didn't realize that handled meant something very specific, that my father and Derek had, over the course of about 4 months, been quietly restructuring who actually owned the business. The transfer document I found was dated March 14th. The toast happened on July 26th at the grand reopening party celebrating the renovation. 4 months between the paperwork and the party. 4 months where I had no idea that the store I grew up in, the store I still worked a Saturday shift at roughly twice a month, unpaid, just because I liked being there, legally belonged to my brother, not my father, and definitely not to any shared family trust I'd always assumed existed. The document specified an ownership split, 80% to Derek Ellison, 20% retained by Walter Ellison. My mother's name wasn't on it at all. Mine wasn't supposed to be either, except it was, in a small paragraph I almost missed on page 3, under a section labeled Waiver of Interest. I, Maren Ellison, hereby waive any current or future claim to ownership, profit, or inheritance related to Ellison Hardware LLC, its assets, or affiliated properties. Signed, supposedly, by me. Dated February 2nd. A date I remembered clearly because February 2nd was my daughter's 4th birthday, and I'd spent the entire day at a bounce house party in Millbrook, not at any lawyer's office signing away my inheritance. I didn't call my father, I didn't call Derek. I called my husband, Isaac, first, because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. Isaac's an ER nurse, which means he's seen more genuine crises in a week than most people see in a lifetime, and it also means he doesn't panic easily. He read the document twice, sitting at our kitchen table at 11 at night while our daughter, Piper, slept upstairs. "That's not your signature," he said finally. "I've watched you sign 1,000 things, that's not it." He was right. My real signature has a distinctive loop on the M and a straight, almost aggressive line under the whole name, a habit left over from a middle school phase where I decided cursive should look official. The signature on the waiver was close. Close enough that a stranger glancing at it might not question it, but the loop on the M was wrong, too round, too careful, like someone had studied my signature instead of simply having it. "Who would even have access to your signature to copy it?" Isaac asked. That question sat with me for days. The honest answer was, a lot of people. I signed things at the store constantly, delivery confirmations, time-off requests, old employee paperwork from summers I'd worked there in my 20s before law school. My signature wasn't some rare, guarded thing. It was on file in at least 4 filing cabinets I could think of off the top of my head. But copying a signature is one thing. Getting it notarized is another. I flipped to the final page of the document, and there it was, a notary stamp and signature dated February 2nd, the same day I was allegedly at a law office instead of a bounce house. The notary's name was Carol Jennings. I recognized that name. Carol Jennings had been my father's bookkeeper for almost 15 years, working out of a small office 2 doors down from the original hardware store. I'd known her my whole life. She'd given me a graduation card when I finished my paralegal certificate. She'd also apparently become a licensed notary at some point in the last few years, something I hadn't known, and something that was about to matter enormously. A notarization isn't just a formality. It's a legal attestation that the notary personally witnessed the signer, in person, willingly signing the document and verified their identity. If Carol notarized my signature on February 2nd, she was either genuinely in a room with a woman who looked enough like me to fool her, or she notarized a signature she never actually watched me make. I didn't sleep that night. Around 2 a.m. I opened my laptop and started a document of my own, not a legal one yet, just a timeline, dates, names. Everything I could remember about the renovation, the loan, the transfer, cross-referenced against my actual calendar, my actual whereabouts, anything I could pull up. I titled the file, only half joking with myself, Proof I Exist. It would end up being 47 pages long by the time this was over. I confronted my mother first, not my father. Partly strategy, partly cowardice. I wasn't ready to look my father in the eye yet, not after the podium, not after the daughter who couldn't be bothered. My mother, Diane, met me for coffee at a place outside of town, away from Millbrook's usual gossip circuit. I brought printed copies of the waiver page. She didn't ask what it was. That told me almost everything. "Your father wanted to protect the business," she said quietly, stirring a coffee she wasn't drinking. "He was worried that if something happened to him, you and Derek would end up fighting over it, or you'd want to sell your share, and he didn't want the store broken up. So he forged my signature." "I don't know anything about a forgery," she said, and there was something brittle in the way she said it, not quite a lie, but not the truth either. "I know there were papers, I know your father said it was handled." Did you sign anything, Mom? She hesitated exactly long enough for me to know the answer before she said it. I signed a spousal consent form for the transfer. Weeks ago. That detail mattered more than she probably realized when she said it. A spousal consent form meant a lawyer had been involved in structuring this at some point, because spousal consent isn't something people randomly think to include unless someone with legal knowledge tells them the transfer could be challenged without it. Someone had built this transfer carefully enough to protect it from at least one angle of attack, which meant someone had thought about the possibility that I, specifically, might come back and challenge it. Whose idea was the 20% Dad kept for himself? I asked. And the 80 for Derek, why not 50-50 at least between the two of you? My mother looked down at her coffee. Derek needed the majority stake. For the loan, that was the first time I heard about the loan. What loan, Mom? She realized, I think, that she'd said more than she meant to. She backpedaled, said something vague about renovation costs and financing, said I should really talk to your father about the specifics, said she didn't want to be in the middle of this. But it was too late. I had a thread to pull now, and pulling threads is, professionally, most of what I do for a living. I went back to my desk at Holloway and Chen the next morning, and on my lunch break, pulled up the county recorder's office public records portal, something I use constantly for actual work, searching property liens and deed transfers for clients. I searched Ellison Hardware, LLC. There was a UCC financing statement filed by First Millbrook Savings Bank, dated April 2nd, 3 weeks after the ownership transfer. It listed Ellison Hardware, LLC's inventory, equipment, and real property as collateral against a business loan. The loan amount was $340,000. $340,000 is a significant loan for a hardware store that, as far as I knew, had done a modest renovation, new flooring, signage, paint. I'd seen the receipts my father had shown proudly to relatives at the reopening party, the kind of receipts meant to be seen. $42,000 for flooring, $18,000 for the new signage and exterior work, roughly $20,000 more in miscellaneous supplies and contractor labor. Even generously rounding up, I couldn't get the renovation itself past $90,000. So where had the other $250,000 gone? I didn't have an answer yet, but I had a guess, and the guess made my stomach hurt. Derek, I need to be fair to my brother here because it would be easy to turn him into a cartoon villain, and that's not what happened, and it's not who he is. Derek isn't a bad person. He's a person who, like a lot of people, got in over his head and made choices under pressure that he probably wishes he could take back. What I eventually learned was that Derek had accumulated significant debt during his years in Chicago, not from anything as dramatic as gambling, though that's what I suspected at first. It was simpler and sadder than that. A failed attempt to start his own small marketing agency after being laid off, using a business line of credit he personally guaranteed, that collapsed within 14 months and left him roughly $190,000 underwater, plus another $60,000 in credit card debt he'd used to try to keep the agency afloat past the point it should have folded. He'd told our parents almost none of this. He'd come home to Millbrook, taken the job at the hardware store, and let everyone believe he was simply figuring things out after Chicago. My father, thrilled to finally have a son interested in the business, never asked too many hard questions. And Derek, drowning quietly, saw an opportunity. Get majority ownership of a business with real assets. The buildings, the inventory, the land the original store sat on. Worth considerably more now than when my grandfather bought it in 1968. And use that ownership as leverage for a loan that would let him climb out of his personal debt hole. Folding it into renovation and business expansion costs that a small regional bank wouldn't look at too closely as long as the collateral checked out. I want to be careful here because at this point in the story, this was still a theory, not a fact. I didn't have proof Derek had misused the loan funds. What I had was a gap, a $250,000 gap between what I could account for and what had actually been borrowed, and a brother who'd never mentioned any of it to me, his sister, who happened to work in property and estate law and who might have noticed exactly the kind of inconsistency I was now noticing. Quick question for you, since we're deep in it now. If you found out a sibling had forged your signature to secure a loan, would you go to the bank first or your family first? Drop your answer in the comments because I genuinely went back and forth on this for almost 2 weeks before deciding. I decided in the end to go to neither. I went to a forensic document examiner first. Her name was Renata Osai, and I found her through a colleague at the firm who'd used her testimony in a contested will case 2 years earlier. Forensic document examination isn't cheap. Renata's retainer was $1,800 for an initial analysis. But I'd been quietly setting aside money since the coffee conversation with my mother, and Isaac didn't hesitate when I told him what I needed to do. I brought Renata the waiver document, along with 11 samples of my actual signature pulled from old employee paperwork, a signed lease, my law firm's internal HR file, and this felt almost too perfect. A birthday card I'd signed for my father 4 years earlier that he'd apparently kept in a box of sentimental items, and that my mother let me borrow, not realizing what I needed it for. Renata's report took 11 days. When it came back, it was more thorough and more damning than I expected. She identified 7 specific inconsistencies between my genuine signature samples and the signature on the waiver. Variance in the pen pressure at the start of each letter, an unnatural pause and restart pattern visible under magnification around the capital M, a slightly different baseline slant, and the detail that would matter most later, evidence consistent with a slow, traced signature rather than a natural, fluid one. In her professional opinion, stated in writing, the probability that the signature on the waiver document was authored by the same individual who produced the 11 comparison samples was low, and consistent with an attempt to replicate rather than an authentic signing. I now had, in writing from a credentialed expert, evidence that my signature had been forged. I sat with that report for 3 days before I did anything with it. Not because I doubted it, I trusted it completely, but because I knew that once I acted on it, there was no undoing what came next. My family, whatever was left of it after the toast and everything since, was about to fracture in a way that might not heal. I thought about my grandfather, a man I barely remembered except through photographs and my father's stories, who'd slept in the back office of that store for over a decade to build something for his family. I thought about the 12-year-old version of me, stocking shelves next to my dad on Saturday mornings, feeling like the most important person in the world for those few hours. And I thought about my daughter, Piper, who was going to grow up hearing about the family store, whether or not it belonged to any of us honestly by the time she was old enough to understand what that meant. I decided I owed it to all 3 of them, my grandfather, 12-year-old me, and Piper, to find out the whole truth, even if it cost me the version of my family I'd been pretending still existed. I called Carol Jennings. I didn't accuse her outright. I asked if I could stop by her office, told her it was about some old paperwork from the store, and she said sure, come by Thursday afternoon. Carol's office hadn't changed in probably 20 years, same wood paneling, same framed photo of her late husband on the desk, same jar of butterscotch candies she'd been offering kids in Millbrook since before I could drive. She looked genuinely happy to see me, which made what I had to do next feel worse. I laid the waiver document on her desk, open to the notarization page, and asked her, as gently as I could, to walk me through her memory of notarizing it. Her face did something complicated, not panic exactly, more like the look of someone doing rapid math they didn't want to do. Your father brought that in, she said slowly. Back in early February. Was I there, Carol? Long pause. Walter said you'd already signed it and just needed the notarization filed properly, since you were busy with Piper's birthday party that day and couldn't come in yourself. There it was. A notary's entire legal function is built around personally witnessing the signature. Notarizing a document based on someone else's assurance that she already signed it, she's just busy, is not a minor technical slip. It's a violation that can cost a notary their commission, and in some circumstances expose them to real legal liability. Carol knew that too. I watched her realize in real time that she'd trusted my father, a man she'd worked alongside for 15 years, a man whose word she'd apparently never had reason to doubt, and that trust had led her to notarize a forged signature on a document that had just legally transferred 80% of a hardware store to my brother. I need you to understand, she said, and her voice was shaking now. I did not know it wasn't real. I would never, Marin. I have known you since you were in diapers. I believed her. That's an important detail, and I want to be fair about it. Carol wasn't a co-conspirator. She was someone my father used, the same way he'd tried to use my absence at a 4-year-old's birthday party as a cover story for a fraud he'd apparently planned out in advance, down to which day would be least suspicious. I asked her one more question before I left. Did Derek know about this, about the waiver specifically? Carol's answer surprised me. Derek wasn't in the room when your father brought it in. Just Walter. That detail sat oddly with me for the rest of the week. If Derek genuinely hadn't known his sister's signature had been forged to make the transfer possible, then the person orchestrating this, the person who decided a forged waiver was necessary, who'd chosen the date, who'd walked it into Carol's office alone, wasn't my brother at all. It was my father. I needed to know whose legal advice had shaped this transfer because the structure of it, the spousal consent form, the specific waiver language, the 80-20 split calibrated to secure a business loan, had the fingerprints of someone who understood contract and estate law well enough to build something that would survive a casual glance, even if it couldn't survive Renata Osai's magnifying glass. The answer, when I found it, was almost insulting in how close to home it was. Gregory Paulson, a semi-retired attorney who'd been my father's golfing partner for almost 20 years, and who, it turned out, had drafted the transfer documents as a favor between old friends, rather than through any formal client engagement with proper conflict of interest disclosures. I found this out through the loan file itself. As part of the UCC financing statement filed with the county, First Millbrook Savings Bank had required a signed legal opinion letter confirming clear title and proper authorization for the collateral, standard practice for a loan of that size. The letter was on file, dated April 1st, signed by Gregory Paulson-esque. I need to explain why this detail mattered so much to me professionally, not just personally. In my job, I've reviewed dozens of these opinion letters. A properly conducted one requires the attorney to verify, genuinely verify, not simply accept a client's word, that all signatures on file are authentic and all necessary parties consented knowingly. Gregory Paulson had signed his name attesting to exactly that, for a document containing a forged signature and a waiver I never knowingly agreed to. Either Gregory had been deceived by my father the same way Carol had, or Gregory had known, or chosen not to look too closely, because he was doing an old friend a favor and didn't want to be the one raising uncomfortable questions about his golfing buddy's daughter's signature. I drove to Gregory's office on a Tuesday afternoon in September, almost 2 months after the toast, with copies of Renata's forensic report in a folder on the passenger seat. Gregory was cordial until I opened that folder. Then his expression shifted into something more careful, more lawyerly, more aware of exposure. Walter told me everything was in order, he said. The signature, the consent, all of it. I had no reason to doubt him. You signed a legal opinion letter attesting to verified authorization, Gregory, not I trusted my friend. Verified. He didn't have a good answer for that. What he did have, eventually, after I made it clear I wasn't leaving without more than vague reassurances, was an admission. He'd never independently confirmed my signature. He'd taken the document my father brought him, already notarized by Carol, and treated the notarization itself as sufficient verification, which is not how a diligent attorney is supposed to operate, but is, unfortunately, how a lot of small-town favor between friends legal work actually happens. I left his office with something more valuable than his admission, though. Gregory, rattled and clearly worried about his own professional exposure now, mentioned, almost as a defensive aside, that my father had specifically told him the 20% retained ownership was temporary, and that Walter planned to transfer his remaining stake to Derek entirely within the next 2 years, once things settled down. Once things settled down. I turned that phrase over for days. Settled down from what? I finally confronted my father in October, 3 months after the toast, in the back office of the hardware store, the same back office my grandfather used to sleep in, the same room where I'd learned to read an inventory ledger at age 14. I brought the forensic report. I brought the loan documents. I brought Carol's account and Gregory's admission, laid out in the calm, methodical way I present evidence to opposing counsel, because some part of me needed the structure of professional distance to get through this conversation without falling apart. My father didn't deny it. That surprised me most of all. I'd braced for denial, for gaslighting, for some version of you're misremembering or you're overreacting. Instead, he sat down heavily in his old desk chair and for the first time in longer than I could remember, looked old to me. I have prostate cancer, he said. Stage 2, diagnosed in January. The room went very quiet. He explained it slowly, the way people explain things they've rehearsed alone in their car for months. He'd been diagnosed in January, told none of us, not my mother, not initially, not until she noticed him disappearing for appointments he claimed were business meetings. His prognosis was reasonably good, treatable, but the diagnosis had apparently detonated something in him. A fear, sudden and consuming, that he was going to die and leave the store, the actual physical proof that his own father's life had meant something in the hands of children who might sell it, split it, or let it fade into something unrecognizable. Derek wanted to come back and actually run it, my father said. You had your own career, your own life at the firm. I thought I convinced myself that you'd rather have money than the store. That giving Derek control was giving the store a future and giving you a clean exit. So instead of asking me, I said, you forged my signature. I panicked. His voice cracked on the word. I was scared, Marin. I didn't think you'd fight me on it if you knew I was sick, and I didn't want you fighting me on it out of pity either. I wanted it done clean. I thought I was protecting everyone. I want to be honest with you about something here. I believed that this was, at least in part, true. Fear does strange things to people, and a cancer diagnosis, kept secret for months, eating at a man who'd built his entire identity around being the strong one, that's not an excuse, but it's a real human motive, not cartoon villainy. I'm telling you this because the version of this story where my father is simply cruel would be easier to tell, but it wouldn't be honest, and I promised myself early on in this process that I'd deal in truth, even when the truth was complicated. But fear didn't explain the loan. Fear didn't explain $250,000 unaccounted for. And when I asked him directly whether he knew about Derek's Chicago debt, about the loan being used for more than renovation, his face told me the answer before he found words for it. I knew there was some debt, he admitted. I didn't know the number. I didn't ask because I didn't want to know. I confronted Derek 2 weeks later at his apartment, not the store. I didn't trust myself to have this conversation surrounded by everything my grandfather built. Derek, unlike our father, did try to deny it at first. He said the loan was for the business, that I was twisting numbers, that I'd always been the one who couldn't just be happy for someone else's success. For about 10 minutes, I genuinely thought I might be wrong about the debt. Then I showed him the Chicago court records, a small claims judgment from a former contractor his failed agency never paid, and a separate collections filing from a business credit card issuer, both public record, both something I'd pulled during my research the same week I'd found the UCC filing. I hadn't known the exact amounts until I found those. Derek's face went pale. You had no right to dig into that, he said, and his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. I had every right to find out why my forged signature helped secure a loan that apparently vanished into your old debts. He broke down after that, not dramatically, just quietly, sitting on his own couch with his head in his hands, and told me the rest. The agency's collapse had left him more underwater than even the court records showed. Once you counted informal debts to friends and a max line of credit he'd been paying only minimum balances on for 2 years. When our father offered him majority ownership of the store as part of modernizing the business, Derek saw a way out, not a scheme he'd planned from day one, he insisted, but an opportunity he'd let himself take once it was offered, without asking too many questions about how our father intended to secure his agreement, or whose signature made it all official. Did you know my signature was forged? I asked him directly. Not at first, he said. I swear to you, not at first. Dad told me you'd agreed to waive your interest, that you didn't want to be tied to the store financially with your own career. I believed him, Marin. I wanted to believe him because believing him meant I didn't have to feel like I was stealing from my own sister. When did you find out? Long silence. When you handed the microphone back, he finally said. I saw your face. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to know what. That, more than almost anything else in this whole ordeal, was the detail that hurt the most. The confirmation that my brother had, on some level, chosen not to look too closely at his own good fortune, the same way our father had chosen not to ask too many questions about Derek's debt. An entire family built on a quiet agreement not to look too closely at each other, as long as looking away kept things comfortable. I want to be clear about something. At this point, I could have simply let it go. My father was sick. My brother was in genuine financial crisis. Confronting them privately had already extracted an admission of guilt from both of them. There's a version of this story where I quietly accept an informal apology, tear up the paperwork, and we all move on pretending the last year didn't happen. I didn't do that, and here's why. A forged, notarized document doesn't just disappear because the people involved feel bad. It sits in county records. It underpins an active $340,000 loan against a business that legally still listed me as having waived all interest in it. If my father's health took a bad turn, if the loan ever defaulted, if Derek's remaining debts caught up with him again, I would have no legal standing, no claim, nothing on a store my grandfather built with his own hands, because of a signature I never made. So I filed a formal complaint with the State Notary Licensing Board regarding Carol's notarization, not out of malice toward her, but because the legal record needed correcting through the proper channel, and a licensing board complaint was, per my own professional knowledge, the fastest route to getting an official finding on record that the notarization was invalid. I also retained outside counsel, someone entirely unconnected to my family, unlike Gregory, and filed a civil action to void the waiver and ownership transfer on grounds of forgery and fraud, supported by Renata's forensic report. The Notary Board's investigation moved faster than the civil case. Within 6 weeks, they issued a formal finding. Carol's notarization of the February 2 document did not meet the legal standard of personal appearance and was invalid. That single finding did most of the heavy lifting in the civil case that followed, because it gave the court an official, independent basis, separate from family testimony, separate from he said she said, to treat the underlying transfer as legally defective from the start. Carol's notary commission was suspended for 18 months and she was fined $2,500. I felt sick about that outcome for a long time, honestly. She wasn't the architect of this. She was a woman who trusted an old friend and paid a real professional price for it. I still think about that sometimes. Gregory Paulson faced a bar complaint. I did not personally file. First Millbrook Savings Bank's own legal department filed it. Once the Notary Board's finding became part of the public record, and the bank realized the legal opinion letter underpinning their $340,000 collateral position had been built on an invalid document. That part was out of my hands entirely, and it moved the bank itself into the picture in a way I hadn't anticipated. I hadn't expected First Millbrook Savings Bank to become its own force in this story, but once their legal department discovered the collateral for a $340,000 loan rested on an invalidated ownership transfer, they moved with an urgency none of us in the family had. The bank's position was straightforward and frankly not sympathetic to any of us. Their loan had been secured against 80% ownership of Ellison Hardware LLC, and that 80% ownership was now legally in question. Under the terms of their loan agreement, a material defect in the collateral triggered a review clause, and the bank had the right to call the loan for immediate review, a process that could, in the worst case, mean demanding accelerated repayment or additional collateral within 90 days. For a family business already strained by renovation costs and Derek's underlying debt, 90 days to potentially restructure or repay a chunk of a $340,000 loan was close to catastrophic. My father, who I want to remind you was in the middle of cancer treatment during all of this, now faced the real possibility of losing the store not through any of our family drama, but through a straightforward bank review triggered by the very fraud he'd committed to try to protect it. I sat with that irony for a long time. Everything he'd done, the forgery, the secrecy, the protecting the legacy, had created the exact outcome he was most afraid of. This is where the case shifted from something I was pursuing against my family into something closer to a shared crisis all of us had to face together, whether we wanted to or not. My civil suit to void the waiver was still active, but I made a decision at that point that I want to explain honestly. I didn't want the store to collapse. Whatever my father and brother had done, my grandfather's business, the actual bricks, the actual inventory, the jobs of the 14 employees who worked there, most of whom had nothing to do with any of this, didn't deserve to disappear because of decisions made in a back office months earlier. I met with the bank's legal team myself with my own attorney present and proposed a restructuring. I would reassert my legitimate ownership stake. The civil case had, by this point, secured a preliminary ruling voiding the fraudulent waiver and become a co-guarantor on a restructured loan alongside my father. With Derek's ownership stake reduced and a formal repayment plan attached specifically to his portion, separate from the store's operating finances, so that his personal debt could never again be quietly folded into the business's collateral without every owner's actual, verified consent. The bank agreed to it after 6 weeks of negotiation. It wasn't generous of them. It was in their financial interest to have a stable, verified ownership structure rather than a defaulted loan and a business in legal limbo. But it worked. The final ownership resolution, reached through the civil settlement roughly 7 months after the toast, split Ellison Hardware LLC 3 ways. 40% to my father, 35% to me, 25% to Derek, with Derek's stake specifically structured to increase gradually over 5 years as he paid down a formal, transparent repayment plan for the money that had gone toward his old debts. Money the family agreed, painfully, to treat as an internal loan rather than pretending it had all gone to flooring and signage. My father's 20% under the original fraudulent transfer became 40% under the corrected one, not because anyone was rewarding him, but because voiding the fraudulent waiver simply restored the ownership structure closer to what should have existed all along, before he tried to engineer his own exit strategy through forgery. I won't pretend the family healed neatly. My relationship with my father is better than it was in the immediate aftermath of that back-office confrontation, but it isn't what it was when I was 14, stocking shelves next to him on Saturday mornings, feeling like the most important person in his world. Something in that trust broke in a way that time has softened but not erased. We talk. We work together actually now that I hold a real stake in the store and sit in on major decisions. But there's a carefulness between us now that wasn't there before, the careful, deliberate honesty of two people who know exactly how badly things can go when honesty is skipped. Derek and I are closer than we've been in years, oddly enough. Something about going through the unraveling of it together, the debt, the confrontation, the shared fear of losing the store stripped away a lot of the sibling competitiveness that had quietly defined our relationship since childhood. He's in year 2 of his 5-year repayment plan now. He still works at the store. He's good at the marketing side, genuinely good, and the store's online presence and local advertising have improved noticeably since he took that over honestly, rather than through a forged shortcut. Carol's notary suspension ended after 18 months. She retired from bookkeeping shortly after, and I still see her sometimes at the grocery store in Millbrook. It's awkward in a quiet, small-town way. I don't think that will ever fully go away, and I've made a kind of peace with that. Gregory Paulson's bar complaint resulted in a formal reprimand and 18 months of mandatory ethics continuing education, rather than suspension. The bar's disciplinary board found negligence rather than intentional fraud, given he genuinely hadn't known about the forged signature, only that he'd failed to properly verify it as his legal opinion letter claimed he had. My mother and I have talked at length about the spousal consent form she signed without asking enough questions. She's told me more than once that she regrets not calling me the moment my father first mentioned the transfer, instead of only telling me the truth after I'd already found the folder myself. I believe she regrets it. I also understand, better now than I did a year ago, how easy it is to go quiet inside a marriage built on decades of trusting your spouse's judgment, even when some instinct is telling you to ask more questions. Almost exactly 1 year after that first toast, we held a much smaller gathering at the store, not a grand reopening this time, just a quiet dinner with employees and close family, marking the completion of the restructured ownership agreement and unofficially my father's clean scan results after his final round of treatment. My father asked me to give the toast this time. I almost said no. Some petty, still hurting part of me wanted to point out the symmetry of it, wanted to make him sit with the discomfort the way I'd had to sit with his toast a year earlier. But I didn't. I stood up in a different dress this time, and I looked at the people in that room, my father, thinner than he used to be but healthier now, my mother, Derek, Isaac, Piper asleep against my shoulder for part of it, Carol even, who'd been invited despite everything, because my father insisted she deserved to see the store still standing. My grandfather built this place with almost nothing, I said, and for a long time I think we all forgot that the actual legacy was never the building or the inventory or even the name over the door. It was supposed to be trust. Somewhere along the way, we let fear replace that. I don't say that to blame any one person in this room. I think we all, in our own ways, chose comfort over hard conversations more than once. I'm just glad we finally had them. I didn't call anyone out by name. I didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew exactly what I meant, and for the first time in over a year, nobody flinched. If you're wondering what happened to that original manila folder, the one I found in my mother's filing cabinet that started all of this, it's still in my desk drawer at home. Not the store's records anymore, not evidence in an active case. Just a reminder, I suppose, of how close we came to losing something because nobody wanted to be the one to ask an uncomfortable question out loud. This story is fictional, created for entertainment and reflection, and any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. If there's one thing I hope you take from tonight's story, it's this. The truth doesn't destroy a family, silence does. The truth just makes you deal with what silence was hiding.